this was an interesting discussion when we thought about what the topic would be and even what to name it, working with Edwin and my colleague Graham. And we really thought about, in some ways, that what a group of strange bedfellows we can all be, an unlikely group of people at times. And that there are amongst us and here and elsewhere, not only are some of us NGOs in a traditional sense, some are social companies, some are large corporations, and others are government entities that all are involved one way or another around change making. But there are roles that we each play. And for many who are looking at that link, particularly between getting to scale and bringing in capital from diverse sources, and being able to really replicate or scale the work that many of you are doing, we looked at their roles of both influencers and enablers. And also, which is the role that one plays? Is it really that an organization is setting the groundwork? Are they an organization that has defined the need, that provides certification, that provides us with the targets and goals, the social goals we want to achieve? Or are you really an enabler as a social entrepreneur too, or a deliverer of services that yourself, which we should expect or could work with to actually deploy capital, whether it's public sector money or it's private sector, to take the work you do to a much larger scale around any one of these many issues that you all focus on. And in many ways, it has to do with sustainability of an organization. It also has to do with what is required that's more than funding. What it really is about capital that helps build an organization's capacity if you're going to team up with other players and large players who get interested in the subject, who see you as having set, as many of us have, in my own world of, through microfinance and elsewhere. So that's the definition of that space. Even the evolution of it came from organizations, very grassroots, bottoms up, if you will, which have replicated and scaled and brought in and influenced, certainly, even in our own business models, what we do. Part of this is to think about how we interact with intermediaries, and can that be, in itself, something we should articulate really well from the start, and you should, because part of it is setting the expectations of your funders and your partners as well from the start as to how far on that journey do you go in terms of taking something to scale or not, and who makes good partners, and which roles do we all play. So, just to start. And I can sit down with my cracky voice as always. On my left here is Antony Ross first, who's a partner and head of social enterprise over at Bridges. Bridges Ventures, for those of us in the UK, have watched it over a number of years, really become a leading, not just a practitioner, even a thought leader and a policy leader. And that's something that I think they are even influencing in the States. So we're going to have Antony speak first. Then we have Premal Shah. Who you?
Should I start now?
Wow. Who you all know.
Needs no introduction.
He's the president of Kiva. And then Chris West, who's been here before from Shell. So, before I go further, Antony.
Go on. Okay. Thank you.
You okay, man?
Thank you. Let me, before I go into my little spiel about what Bridges does, let me just start with a sort of a thought. Is that are we heavy on influencers and light on enablers? That will be my sort of my question that I would ask from an investor's perspective. So what is Bridges? We're a fund manager, essentially. We manage two types of funds. We manage a group of funds, which is where we started, which is funds that back commercial businesses that deliver a social impact through primarily through what they do. And then we also we have funds, that's the bulk of the funds we manage, and we also manage funds that invest in social enterprises that run a different type of business model, but also to deliver social impact. Everything that we do drives social impact. And to give, just to try and capture the difference between those two, when we back private sector businesses, we're looking for businesses where there is a genuine lockstep in the way that they grow their business and deliver impact. So probably a couple of examples. We backed in the UK the first low-cost gym. It's been something that's successful in the US and Germany. We brought it over to the UK. It has a great social impact. It's a low cost. It enables the gyms we have over 50% of first-time gym users. It's also a very successful financial model. And we started it up. We proved the first one, and we've rolled them out, and we now have 200,000 members and about 30-odd gyms spread across the UK. That's a pure, absolute lockstep model. It's attractive financial returns and really high social impact through making available those services. We have an oil recycling business, very similar, successful in terms of taking old oil, turning it back into base oil, and has also generated jobs actually in deprived area of the UK. And again, very much a lockstep type business. The other businesses we back are social enterprises, and in social enterprises it clearly isn't an absolute lockstep. By definition, many of them are probably going to deliver something less than a purely commercial financial return. So what we look there in those enterprises is a winning model. I think it's really important for me when we're looking for a social enterprise, why it's going to be successful, is have they got something inherent in their way they operate as a social enterprise, which means that they will become the de facto deliverer of that service. So an example of that would be home care, domiciliary care as we call it in the UK, where we've backed an employee-owned model because one of the problems in domiciliary care, I think internationally, is high staff turnover. High staff turnover is obviously representative of bad staff conditions, and that also then results in bad service to beneficiaries, because beneficiaries like to get a consistent helper. So if you can build up a model which is employee-owned, where you get much lower staff turnover, you get a potentially more cost-effective model, and you also deliver a better service to the end user. But as an investor, it's not going to be as attractive financially as a purely private sector business, but it's a winning model. So that's what we look for. And we do that across a number of themes or areas, which is health and well-being and environmental and education and underserved communities. So coming then to the question, so going back to my sort of why do I think influencers and enablers? Who are influencers? I think the traditional sort of thought is that influence for me, we'll all put our own perspective on it, is influencers are the entrepreneurs, the drivers, the people who sort of make and shake and get things to happen. And I suppose what we're seeing as this sector grows, and many of you are representative here, I think, is that as opposed to maybe in the conventional venture industry, or maybe the venture industry change in this way, where you've got busy entrepreneurs coming out with great ideas, and then the enablers, if you like, if the financiers would support them to do it, I think those lines are getting blurred. I think when one looks at hopefully some of the things we've done, certainly if you look at some of the things that Acumen has done, I would say they are very much influencers. They are proactively making stuff and coming up with new models. So that it's a blurred line. And for me, when looking at that blurred line, I see those active drivers of change. Who then are the enablers? And increasingly, I think what we're seeing is the enablers are the people who are going to really take what is a great idea, whether it comes from a very proactive fund manager or an entrepreneur, that makes that idea scale. And I'm going to pull out sort of, maybe we each come up with that gap. So, who are the two, as we operate in the market, where are the two big areas where we see enablers are having a big impact? One, and I can't think of a better way of describing it, is just robust, solid management capability. Management tends to fall into, we have the visionary leaders, and I think as a sector, we're well blessed with those. But actually what many of the social enterprises need is just a really good ability to deliver. And actually, to make that happen, they're going to have to suck in resource from probably quite conventional industry that has done it before. Because many of the social enterprises are operating in areas where it's about core service delivery. So I'll leave that as a thought. That's one key area that we see. The other key enabler that I think is critical for many of us in the sector is government. Many social enterprises, if they're going to have a sustainable model, are dependent on ultimately the service being bought or paid for by government, directly or indirectly. The way government commissions operates, the way it interacts with these enterprises is a key enabling. And if I want to, I think you asked for an exemplar. If I want to pick out an exemplar, I'm sure anyone here from UK government? You laugh, you laugh. I would say what the UK government here is doing at the moment, the Cabinet Office, in trying to make things happen in social enterprise is an example of how government can be a very effective enabler, because they are making stuff happen. So, is that enough of introduction?
That's a great introduction.
Yeah.
And then I'll catch you with.
Yeah, go on.
I'll give you a question though. When we look at the organizations that we're working with, in this sort of a setting, and in the UK, where one of the challenges is deploying a lot of capital around community development. If there was that much capital to deploy, as you know, it's been a long time coming, getting big society capital and others to raise and get permission to get this capital in. There's a dearth, though, of intermediaries that can really deploy that.
Yeah.
What does that lead you to do then differently? I mean, where are you finding the ability to actually now deploy capital?
Well, where is the dearth? Is the dearth in the intermediaries who are trying to make that capital work, or is the dearth in the opportunities where they want to put it, or where they feel, and I was talking with Nigel Kershaw he's trying to move this idea that intermediaries are saying businesses or enterprises aren't investment ready, and he's saying, well, it's because we haven't got the right money, which is a fair challenge. But I do think my perspective, I think there is a need for more genuinely sustainable winning models, as I described it earlier. And I'm not sure the sector has quite worked out, not enough in the sector have worked out what a social enterprise business that is genuinely going to be a long-term sustainable model should look like. So we see lots of enterprises have fantastic social impact, great ideas, but they are essentially going to be forever and a day, have to be philanthropically supported. If we're going to talk about social enterprise and sustainable models, relatively few have worked out how to make it genuinely sustainable. So who are then the enablers? I think increasingly what you're finding is that the intermediaries, and an example here will be social finance, I suppose, and even ourselves, like I described with the gym, are going out and shaping that model ourselves, and then bringing in the enablers to deliver it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Okay, now, and Premal needs really little introduction, and better than I gave before as I gasped away. But, one of the Kiva movement that has been so profound and in a way of connecting individual to individual as one feels, as the experience, as I see the entrepreneur, I see the enterprise, the need, the opportunity, and I can engage that. That model, though, has worked through intermediaries by and large, too. In the case of Kiva, it's been largely the microfinance institutions. That's broadening, though. And even to the extent of their work in kind of a cloud, in Zip, I think it is, I have to go play on that one, but you're almost going to intermediate direct, disintermediate some of those enablers or others. So I think you've gone through an evolution of looking at the types of institutions it will take for you to deliver what your investors, if you will, are seeking, which is that impact, and to be able to do it at scale and across a range of assets at this point. So maybe promote that thinking you could speak.
Sure. So when Kiva first began, the intention was to go direct person to person. And as we tried to scale that model, we ran into a lot of fraud, a lot of issues that just made that model unscalable, so that when we launched in 2006, throughout that year, 2006, 2007, following a stint on PBS Frontline World that was paid for by Skoll Foundation, our website crashed, but when the website got back up, because we're on this $22 a month server plan, when the website got back up, it was this unusual situation, I guess, in philanthropy and altruism, where there were no loans that you could fund on the website. And at that moment, the idea of, we would work through some of our friends that we had in East Africa, and they would on-lend the money, and it'd really be person to person. That's when we realized that original innovation would not scale. And so we switched to a model where we started working with microfinance institutions. And at the time, you had to be crazy as a microfinance institution to actually sign up with Kiva because the idea that the internet community would provide 0% interest patient capital was a new idea, hard to believe. And fast forward to today, there's about 200 MFIs, microfinance institutions around the world, that are actively posting on Kiva. And our theory of change there isn't the money that's being transacted to the MFIs. It's actually viewing the microfinance institutions on the ground, and there's 10,000 of them around the planet, as frontline social innovators. And we want to give them the patient capital, the R&D space to try something that is currently at their risk and cost frontier. So let me give an example of that. Today, student lending in the developing world is pretty broken, and we're pretty inspired by Vitana, who is a model that is similar to Kiva that started doing student lending. And essentially, the whole idea is, what if MFIs started making loans to students where there were no payments for 5 years or no payments for 10 years, so that they could actually go to college, earn a degree, and then have a nice income multiple versus not having gone to college, and then start paying back after a certain grace period. And we're very early across 20 different countries in different experiments in student lending right now with microfinance institutions. And the whole goal is just for the internet community to be influencers for these enablers who would essentially one day discover, this is the hope, that 10 years from now or 20 years from now looking back, that we could develop a heuristic that an 18-year-old girl in Kenya who gets an accounting degree from Strathmore University, that cohort will repay at a 98% repayment rate. If so, that can be scaled by the markets. And banks will pull it into the mainstream lending portfolio, and they'll no longer be the realm of subsidy. Versus if it's a sub 85% repayment rate, then we know that's the realm of subsidy, and we go to government actors. But that's a way of trying to catalyze a whole student lending market or address the higher education. The other thing that we started looking at, Antony, you talked about, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem right now in impact investing. Talk to impact investors and they say there's a lack of deal flow. And if you talk to a lot of social entrepreneurs, they say, well, you call it the right kind of money. It's the IRR expectations are 7-8% returns. What we have right now is so uncertain, or it requires a degree of patience, that there is a little bit of this logjam right now. And what I get really excited about is turning the Kiva platform, all of us, this compassionate capital, towards other impact areas outside of finance. So, for example, there's an amazing group in Kenya right now called Komaza. Komaza is a 4-year-old social enterprise that does microforestry. They work with subsistence farmers to diversify their revenue streams by planting trees, eucalyptus trees. You can only harvest and sell that tree for lumber, for light poles, at year 7. So essentially, there's a 7-year grace period that's needed for the money that's invested into these seedlings. Well, right now, if you look at the IRR in the out years, if the market prices hold for lumber, and if there's not disease and drought, Komaza, it's a for-profit social enterprise in Kenya. They will be incredibly profitable, and their farmers will have a whole new income stream. But it's too risky by impact investors out there, and they're struggling to get by. So they've gotten a bunch of donor funding from Malago, Peary Foundation, a bunch of Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, but they're unable to kind of jump to the next level, and they're kind of struggling right now. Well, just in the last 2 months, they've now raised $450,000 from the internet community on Kiva. And the first loan repayment will be 7 years from now. And it's incredibly patient capital that I think all of us are willing to do because we feel connected to the impact that we can make. And the hope is that one day Komaza can be weaned off of the internet community's capital and the donor capital and go on to your portfolio and other portfolios and really scale up. So, I think when we think about how we make an impact, it's so much more than the money that goes through the platform. Kiva just crossed $400 million in loans and 1 million entrepreneurs receiving money. But that's not the point. The point is, what's the demonstration effect of the money? And how can we actually create more R&D or enable more R&D for the frontline innovators out there? And then ideally attract follow-on funding for those things that are working.
So in your if we think of it, your work, you've been in many ways an influencer yourself, obviously, of raising the awareness and of attracting resources and funding towards an issue of entrepreneurship, if we think of the broad term, of the kind of organizations and individuals that you really seek to fund are individuals in the end. But the enablers were these intermediaries in some ways. As you now look again at going direct to individuals. Is that disintermediating the intermediaries because they don't have the capacity to do what you're hoping to do? Or is it your investors would rather that immediate contact?
So about a year ago, we launched a pilot called Kiva Zip. And it goes back to the founding intentions of Kiva and what we think the internet holds a lot of promise for, which is true direct peer-to-peer lending at 0% interest. And I'll give you an example of why we feel like this is, in 100 years, the big idea. Maimonides, Jewish theologian, philosopher, talked about kind of the 8 levels of helping people. And he said, is an anonymous gift better than a non-anonymous gift? He kind of ranked 8 different ways to help one another. And at the very top of that ladder of helping someone else is a 0% interest loan to help someone gain economic self-sufficiency, like start a business. And I think that's just an old idea. You lend to friends, you don't expect a rate of return, and we want to bring that, see if we can do that now that M-Pesa exists in Kenya, and we can reach people directly, and PayPal in the US. So let me tell you how it works. Essentially, in Kenya and the US, we're relying on trust networks. Say a church pastor. We trust a church and the church pastor. If a church pastor vouches for someone in her congregation, we'll let that person, say in Oakland, California, get a starter $5,000 loan. Right now, banks in the United States, when you apply for a loan, about 7 out of 10 small businesses, when they apply for a loan, get rejected. And the top 3 constraints for small businesses, for example, in the US, are capital. And so what we're wondering is can we actually rely on trust networks and technology to first provide that starter loan? And can you vouch for someone else? And what we're seeing is some really interesting results. So we have 400 loans in Kenya, 400 people in Kenya who have received a loan that's been vouched for by an NGO or by an individual, and 200 in the US. And let me tell the story of Victor. Victor is a Mexican-born immigrant who moved to San Francisco, wanted to get a loan to start a coffee shop in San Francisco. Was unable to get a loan because it's super risky, has no cash flows to demonstrate, and his credit score doesn't tell you anything about his character. Right? And so essentially he goes to a technical assistance provider in the Mission called the Mission Economic Development Agency, graduates from 60 hours of business training workshops, and then applies for a loan. But like 8 out of 10 people who graduate from these business training workshops, he wasn't able to get a loan still from the local CDFI. So that organization, MEDA, vouched for Victor, and we allowed him to post up a $5,000 starter loan on Kiva Zip. 63 people chipped in towards that $5,000 loan, and a year later, Victor had 100% repaid his loan. Now he's on his way to becoming mainstreamed into the financial system because with that, and we report to the credit bureaus when he pays back, so this should allow him to basically go on his way and get higher loan amounts because he can't get very much off of the Kiva website. So as his coffee shop grows, he grows. But what's really cool is Victor now becomes a trustee. He can endorse people in his community. And he's now endorsed 3 people in his community that need a starter loan. One woman he endorsed is Rocio. Rocio basically is a house cleaner in San Francisco, and she brings her vacuum cleaner on the BART, on the public transportation. It's just this huge thing. And she wanted $3,000 to buy a car so she could clean more houses per day, be more productive, earn more income. She now is paying back her loan, and she's now vouched for Eva, who sells basically electronics at a local flea market. It's expanding these trust networks similar to how eBay did. We're all here because of Jeff Skoll's brilliance with eBay, that reputation system where if you actually ship that flat screen TV that someone bought, paid you for, your reputation goes up and you can sell more and get more opportunity, but yet it's sustained by trust. That's the thing that we're trying to do both in the US and in Kenya. In Kenya, let me give you the data. It's still early on Kiva.org, the main website, that's an intermediated model. There's a 98% repayment rate. On Kiva Zip, it's an 87% repayment rate. So we haven't figured it out yet. It is more risky, but we're still working on kind of new ways of trying to figure out what are the determinants of people wanting to repay. And it goes back to when a teacher believed in you in school, you tried a little harder. We really believe that's the fundamental nugget there, which is if someone vouches for you, sticks their neck out for you, you'll want to step up and pay back that loan.
you go back to your starting point. Then, in many ways, then the technology provides and the trust networks make up for the enabler. I mean, the enabler is vastly distributed as opposed to going through the aggregation of lending to microfinance institutions, which for many of us we have. The next person and your idea of lending, I can't help but, when you say Maimonides, just reminds me, at zero interest rate, for anybody trying to do Islamic finance, you would find the word zakat is very similar. And the idea of zakat is you really would lend it, and you take risk. That you take a level of risk, right? No prefixed return. And to do zakat, really to fulfill it properly, you also would be anonymous in many cases. You would not be fulfilled and paid through your self-aggrandizement or reputation. Mm-hmm. So it's great. When we look at Chris now, his is such an interesting model that, as I've followed over the years, it's very different. And Shell Foundation is a big organization with many different arms that you certainly have many tools so you can operate from around the issues that you focus on. But one of them that you've done is funds, and you've raised and you brought capital down, small business and other segments, and had to really make hard decisions. Who manages funds? Who are the distributors of those and decide on those investments? And I'm curious about those intermediaries too, and what have been your experiences there?
Just maybe straw poll hands on the topic influencers and enablers. Who thinks they're an influencer in the room? Any hands? Influencers? Okay. Any enablers here then? Okay, more enablers. I mean, I guess I'll try and do my little intro presentation quickly in that I think we've had to be both an influencer and an enabler to achieve scale. And given you're all in my country and as a terrible analogy that I'm famous for, if I structure my talk around the ghost of scale up past, the ghost of scaling up present, and the ghost of scaling up future, and what we've learned over the course of this, and why echo some of what Antony was saying at the beginning. So I'll just frame us first of all, and then I'll talk around some of the issues around disruption and then scale. So first of all, to frame us, we set up in the year 2000. Right from the outset, we had a mission to catalyse scalable and sustainable enterprise-based solutions to big global development challenges. Now, back in the year 2000, believe it or not, words like social entrepreneur and impact investing weren't in common usage, but we always knew that was kind of what we wanted to do without having the terminology. And right from the outset, we had a view that the way that we could try and do this was through tackling a few issues, so focus on some issues, and for us that meant energy poverty, energy environment related issues, so job creation through the SME sector, access to energy, sustainable mobility, value chains. Through working in partnership with organisations, so I ban the word project in my organisation, and through deploying more than money. I've always been a believer that the solution to any particular problem relies on more than money. So what do we bring by way of business skills, our market linkages, our convening power, in addition to the funds that we can bring to the table? And the concept of enterprise-based for us, which was again quite new and radical at the time, was can we find market-based solutions that we can support with good entrepreneurs over time to achieve financial viability and therefore an exit from subsidy dependence. So that's crudely what we were trying to do. This is tough. What I thought would be really easy was really difficult. I had this naive view many years ago that we would be running a relay race where folk like us would be running the first 100 meters and we'd be trying to find the innovators, the disruptors, and we'd give them the leg up on the ladder. And then, hey-ho, other people would be picking them up and running the other 3 legs of that relay race. Wrong. I would say, on the theme of this concept, the conference around disruption, I mean, first of all, I would say from our side that in every instance where we've looked at a big global development challenge, we have found so far that the route to scale and sustainability comes through picking new partners with new business models. That's number one. That the existing folk who are out there, we didn't necessarily think were fit for that purpose. They're fit for other purposes, but scale and sustainability not, for lots of reasons. being disruptive in itself is difficult. I mean, you need to be entrepreneurial yourself. You need to have good partner selection criteria. And you've got to have good networks, because this is not something where you stick an advert out in a newspaper or on a website and say, come to me if you want to be innovative, because you'll probably get all the wrong people being innovative with you. So it's a very active and engaged way, and it's difficult in itself. But I would say, and we thought that the disruptive element of what we were doing was our real differentiator. Actually, being disruptive in many ways is the simplest bit, because we have found over the years that we've had some extremely good partners that we've managed to find and work with in a genuine sort of joint venture type relationship with, who have developed scalable and sustainable models of the type that Bob alluded to. However, what I think we've learned in the last 10 years, and what I'm continuing to learn, is that post-disruption, post-finding something new with someone new behind it, you encounter a whole series of challenges. First of all, I think, is what I would call the internal issue to that enterprise. You need to put in a huge amount of support to develop a management capacity to execute against a plan. Number one, let's not get real. We are investing in people. I'm not investing in business plans, I'm investing in people. If you get the wrong people, you have a problem. So you have to be smart about selecting people, and they have to be assisted and supported to develop that capacity. Now, I was an entrepreneur by background. I know very well myself. Entrepreneurs are not necessarily the easiest people in the world to deal with. I mean, you think you know everything, but actually it's trying to help people overcome the deficiencies. So that's number one. There's the execution capacity, which requires far more than money. It means working very closely with people, challenging them, supporting them, working in a genuine partnering way. I think secondly, I would say that there's a truism in life that the only things that are true are death, taxes, and a business plan or change. You need to be flexible. What you start out doing and you think you're doing will change. So unless you have a partner that understands flexibility and goes with the changes and understands why you need to do it, you're probably killed. And I think in this market, people who give short-term finance, distant related, are going to kill the very people that they're trying to support. You have to work in a different, highly engaged, highly active way where you understand what the market challenges are and how to overcome them. Then I think there's the issue of capital. Now, we have always thought that we would specialise in making available at the early stage a very, very early stage, high-risk role. We're taking people without necessarily track record of having done anything differently. So we're taking a very, very angel investor type role. You find that you need to give support, particularly subsidy support at that stage, to build up capacity so that they can operate at scale and the systems in place to do it. You cannot drip feed this. If you drip feed money, you will never get to scale. And that was the classic project-based funding model. So someone or some people in this landscape need to be hugely risk-taking in supporting disruption and entrepreneurs. That's that. Then you've got the external factors. In every case where we've had a partner that has gone to scale, and we've had some real successes in the job creation through the SME sector with an African SME specialist financier, through mobility, through some access to energy partners in India and Africa. But the lessons that come back from all these partners in different sectors and different geographies are that as a pioneer grows and scales, they encounter a whole series of market barriers. You're either pushing a new product or service, or you're doing something new. Examples, let's say on the energy side, you want to introduce a new energy product, solar lights, for example, for which there's a massive market demand. The distribution capacity simply isn't there. So you can have the greatest widget you like, but can you get it to market? No, you can't, because you've got to build the whole route to market distribution channels. The distributors don't have the working capital to stock things. So it's not as though there isn't consumer demand. It's not as though you haven't got a widget. It's not as though you haven't got an entrepreneur that knows how to sell it. You just can't get it. So you have to build the market in which the entrepreneur can work. Social marketing. Often you're having to inform people about new products or services that they've never had before. Social marketing, as we all know, is hideously difficult. You can't expect a social entrepreneur with a low margin business to afford social marketing. So again, how do you do that in a way that shifts behaviour change? Thirdly, finance. Look, I probably shouldn't say this in an impact investing forum, but I mean, there's too little, too late. My analogy of a relay race, I thought that we would develop people, get a bit of track record, and then the impact investors will all come over and say, oh, I'd like one of those, please. Wrong-o. And if there is, it's usually Forex-related money in small amounts. So these businesses need investors that have a realistic expectation of return from this market. Even getting to no net loss would be a major achievement in this sector. Let's get real. Yet these are marginal return businesses in the whole. And yet you have the whole development finance industry that expects net double-digit returns from a market that is nascent. It's just unrealistic. So you've got a financing blended instrument. Then you've got market reform type issues. Take another example. Done a lot of work on clean cook stoves. Lots of people want to clean in ways that make them more healthy and fuel efficient. What's clean mean? Unless you have someone out there setting standards and codifying what things are, you have cheap imported products coming in, you have poorly performing products. So at some point, you need an organisation that creates the policy environment, the structures, the incentives that actually codify change and allow it to happen. So you've got the problems of supporting disruptors, which in hindsight is probably the easiest bit. Then you've got this long, patient, flexible, tough journey of taking things to scale, where if you only support the entrepreneur and his and her team, you are never going to get to scale, because all these external influencing factors that will constrain an intermediary's success will come to bear. Impact investing is doing a slice of that. You have to have people, I would say, like us, doing the early stage heavy lifting to create pipeline. You have to have people offering subsidy to keep these things going over a long, tough journey, because they aren't going to deliver immediate returns. You have to have people who will subsidise piloting ways to offset market barriers, and you have to have people who have policy interactions with government or other organisations that can codify change. If you don't bundle all that together, you will get an underperforming sector. So if I was to go back to what Antony said by way as a challenge to begin with, I see from where I sit, our challenge, and I think challenge for all of us, is that we need to do far more in the creating the environment in which these organisations can work, as well as just supporting them themselves. Thanks, Bob.
And I think there's something you raised that, again, I thought with Antony too, and again, of course, differently for those who are making equity investments versus debt. There's always a different role one plays, and the role of the intermediaries will differ as well. But you both bring up that issue, and I think for me, one of the questions we have, Antony, on you too, is when you're investing, you accept when you're doing private equity, early stage venture capital, that you're not just putting in capital or equity or even debt. You're putting in people often, aren't you? You're taking control of an organization sometimes as well. You take board seats or not, right? I mean, you're not passively passing capital down for others to continue to creatively experiment necessarily. That seems to be a very different dynamic. Is it for you? I mean, how when you get into this space, how is that translated? This what I would use as the extreme of pure commercial private equity.
I think absolutely the impact investment space is recognising that the need, if you're going to invest substantial amounts of capital, as other investment, I suppose the venture industry is, I think, which is more analogous than the private equity industry. It is hands-on investing. The businesses need a degree of support, which may not come directly, but it's beholden on the investor to bring the networks and contacts and support and engagement to help those businesses thrive. I think that, I mean, just to talk about in terms of the sort of returns, I think what you have is an impact industry that's growing that recognises the returns aren't in that double-digit space, actually. I do think there is an acknowledgement of that. I think there is there's this great debate over whether if returns were higher, will the sector grow faster because more money will be attracted? My own view is actually if the sector can demonstrate that it can return the money with something, it will grow rapidly. That's where I suspect your private investors aren't in a dissimilar box, actually. Is getting the capital back with something is probably the tipping point of really scaling, attracting capital to the space. So there is a tolerance of lower returns, which is wholly appropriate for when it's driving impact rather than trying to drive financial return first. But either way, the core role as trying to scale up an enterprise as an investor is to help them do it. And that requires a hands-on support. And there is this transition, I think, from the enterprises that you're supporting, which are inevitably, you can't bring in that level of support as well as the capital. So you're beholden on the individual making it happen to start with, in many cases. But when the organisation really wants to transition to rapid scaling, it often needs support, and I think the investors should be bringing that value. Mm-hmm. That's my. I was quite interested. Can I ask a question?
Please. I'm going to now open to do that. Exactly.
Can I ask one question? Because actually, the Kiva model is very effective as disintermediating. But actually, I think you were talking earlier, recognising the need for those businesses to have support. You could almost become also a portal for attracting that support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just building off the most recent example, remember Rocio, who had the vacuum cleaner on the public on the public transportation, and she has a car now. What I get excited about, I think it's something between like 20 and 40 people who chipped in for her first $3,000 loan, is that those, let's say 30 people now become potential brand advocates, potential customers, potential mentors, advisors, and just people who believe in you, real people, right? And so, and they kind of build the social capital around the business. Right now, Kiva's model is actually quite intermediated, and it's in our point of leverage is to help those intermediaries do R&D, to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And what I get excited about is one thing that we've learned is, in addition to kind of let's say people support and other inputs, organizations are really concerned with what they look like. And so we introduce 7 different social performance badges. You could get a poverty alleviation badge if you do, for example, actual poverty assessment measurement. You can get different badges based on things that you choose to prioritize and not prioritize, oftentimes at a cost to your organization. And what's interesting is just by putting badges on these organizations on the website, it's caused conversations in the boardrooms and at the C-level of these organizations of, why did that other organization down the street that's using Kiva have 4 badges? How do we get that 4th badge? And that was something that was also interesting, as well as understanding those dynamics. But it's so much broader than the capital. It's community and capacity. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask some questions here, but I also would have had thought there would be more influences in the audience, or people identifying themselves as influences than enablers. So it's interesting that people feel they are the enablers on the whole. There are those who've tried to put capital out and looked at, also funds that could be capable ways of doing that. And I know that's been the case. I know Mitchell, for example, at OPIC, you at OPIC have been working on this space in some ways. And one of the challenges is perhaps the intermediaries and the capacity to really deploy that kind of capital. Building on what we have here, can you just give us a sense from your own experience? Because I know OPIC's been, in the last 3 years, I would say pretty much, you've been both in environmental space and in other areas of social finance, trying to deploy more capital in a different route.
My name is Mitchell Strauss, and I work on financing and political risk insurance for a government agency called OPIC. And we have been in finance with positive financial and social and environmental return for 40 years. But just as was mentioned, when we didn't know these words, some of these words we use now, there were some of us who tried to do what is now impact investment support, but we called them bell ringers. So if it was a woman-owned or served women, and it was in Africa, and it had something to do with the environment that was good, that was 3 bells. We get in the annual report, and everybody was happy. It was win-win. So over the course of the last few years, we've done 2 forays into attempting to raise funds. The first was equity funds, and the second time we opened it up for hybrid funds and debt vehicles. And lots of people applied. For the second, we had 88 proposals. We ultimately selected 6 equity funds to support, about $285 million. And we're working with a couple of finance-related transactions. But we and the fund managers selected face this conundrum of not being able to raise enough of the right type of capital from the right type of people. And I am so heartened to hear what the panelists have all said, because it reflects our common knowledge as we move forward in the space, that we need to fill the gaps in on the supply side by people's appetites for risk and social return in the heart. And then we need to fill in the types of financing vehicles that are available for the deployment of capital, so that people at early stage, are matched up with the right kinds of people. And we're starting to do this. And so when you see Kiva branch out, when you see the ability to invest $5,000 in a local commercial real estate project that you wouldn't have been able to do, and I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I know there's some of you here, but I can't be making $100,000 investments in anything. And yet I have a pretty long number of years of trying to do that at my very core, and wishing to participate in that which I try to assist with all my colleagues. I mean, it seems to me that if all the development firms and the law firms and the accountants and all of us and the consultants, we all got together and put some money into a big vehicle, wowie zowie, imagine what we could support. Mm-hmm. Thanks for asking me.
I'm going to open for questions. Please, go ahead. There's a mic. We're just right behind you.
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. So we have 3 speakers who've all tried to build things in ecosystems that were at various stages of development. Shell did the cook stoves thing then when there wasn't a Global Cook Stoves Alliance, and now there is. And Kiva's been a rocket ship, but a rocket ship that's made some brilliant decisions, and I would say been millennial testing. And you're working in a great environment in the UK. Surrey Health, if it's the one you invested in, is a great organization. Anyway, what would you like to see in terms of a support environment? We talk about enablers, but what do you want an enabling system to look like? If you could have a scaling engine that you could plug into your social enterprise, what would that scaling engine include, and how would you interface with it, and how much value would that have for you?
Any of you?
I'll start. It's quite hard when talking about small businesses to almost, because we're talking about growth of small businesses in many cases, to try and overlay some system, because by definition they don't sort of want a system, if you like, and it's the challenge many governments have when they try and intervene and support. If I come back to what I pointed out originally, if I want to identify one thing, it will be a pool of really capable management talent with experience that wanted to become part of the social enterprise movement. Because I think that we're at a point, and actually your flags are quite interesting, because what your flags are saying for investors is people are increasingly being attracted by the social impact, negative or positive, of an enterprise. So we are seeing a mindset change. And we're seeing a mindset change in some investors, and we're seeing a mindset change in some consumers. I'd like to think, and I do some lecturing at London Business School, and I can see it with the business school, you can certainly with Skoll here, we're seeing a mindset change, I think, in some MBAs coming through. If we get a greater pool of talent that thinks, actually, I want to run a business as a social enterprise, or I want to be part of a business that's being run as a social enterprise, that to me is what is, if I could access that pool as a a fast growth venture business in Silicon Valley can, where it's offering a pile of options and everyone wants to go and join it. That's part of the engine that drives those enterprises. We need that same pull, and we need to find a way of really pulling them into this sector to help drive the enterprises we want to build.
There's a Mike. Can you just pass it?
Thanks. Ben Thornley from Pacific Community Ventures. I just wanted to follow on a couple of your comments seem to be headed in this direction, and I was just hoping you could expand on a little bit. Bob, you had talked about the capital plus model of VC, where technical assistance is a key component of that. Antony, you had asked Premal that same question: can Kiva be used to really rally a community of mentors to the businesses that are borrowing? And my sense is that what you do, Chris, is also probably not particularly scalable, that very hands-on way that you approach the market. And so is what we need actually like a call to national service, literally from like the president or the prime minister, where they're literally saying we need business people and entrepreneurs to volunteer their time to social enterprises to help them build their capacity to do this more successfully? Because it seems like the missing ingredient you've all been talking about is management capacity. And we know that there are ways to help develop management capacity through the kind of TA that venture capital as a model provides. Mm-hmm. Now we do this a little bit ourselves in the Bay Area, but it's small. We have 200 volunteers who help small businesses in low-income communities. We need 200,000 volunteers just in the United States to help businesses become more investment ready. And that to me seems attainable. Like President Obama could say something in his State of the Union address and call people to national service to do that, to help grow small companies. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that might be. How do we really rally our countries to the challenge of building that capacity?
It's a great question. I'm not asking the panelists. I would just say it builds on what I think I keep hearing from my colleagues, that the tools of venture capital are often being applied to social yourselves and many of your initiatives. How would you attract it? And it's all quite entrepreneurial. But venture capitalists not only get capital, they often get resources of skills and other resources that are harder when you're a nonprofit to get without giving the options, without necessarily building it into the equity or the grant. Unless one really looks at that TA and that old term probably has to be revisited and not thought of as just as TA, which was always called a subsidy. But actually, it's a tool for enabling the deployment of that capital, against the objective that you set. So I really think that, Ben, what you're saying, but building on what all of you've said, is really very, very valid.
There's kind of two ideas. One is, I was talking to someone at TechnoServe, actually at a forum that Edwin and Graham and others organized on rural ag finance. And TechnoServe does a lot of technical assistance. So, for example, with our farmer cooperative, they might put in a wet mill so that co-op can actually do more value added before they sell their cocoa beans and earn more money. And we were talking about the idea of, if the mill costs $25,000, could they mark it up to $35,000 to pay for the technical assistance? And then if we can make the amortization schedule of that loan, say 30 years, like your mortgage, right? So it's such small payments that it's affordable by that co-op, so that they could pay not only for the capital equipment, but for the technical assistance. We could find a new way to not always have to find the subsidy up front, but we could have the folks who are earning more income actually pay for it over time. And so maybe we could break that logjam of who pays for technical assistance. To your other idea of, what if government leaders, what if we created essentially, a business mentor corps or a capacity building corps? There are, I think, different programs that exist today. We have a program called the Kiva Fellows program, and I think the great tragedy of it is right now there's only an 11% acceptance rate. So only 1 in 10 people who apply for the program are able to even get into the program. We have a hard time finding great placement opportunities and having our own capacity to kind of make sure that the fellow as well as the entity on the ground have a really valuable relationship. And so I think it signals that there's deep interest for people to want to pay their own way, do things if they can be productively used. I think where we're struggling is a little bit in the matchmaking and how to kind of create those opportunities, those placement opportunities at the right time, where advice on how to set up an accounting MIS or whatever is the right intervention at that time. We still struggle with that matchmaking a bit.
Chris, you.
Yeah, I think for any venture to succeed, you need a blend of skills, appropriate finance, market linkages, and the appropriate policy environment in whatever mix is there. So if we focus on the skills bit, I have to say, I might be alone in this room, I have a really allergic reaction to the word technical assistance. For me, that is the ghost of development past, and I struggle with it. And why do I struggle with it? Because it's often used as a way of buying down operational cost and getting a third party in who might, I'm sure, be extremely bright and capable of helping someone else. The reverse to this is to say you need these ventures to develop their own capacity, because they're not going to succeed unless that is internal to them. Now, the way you do that is, to some extent, then people need to move away from this project-based giving where you only pay for the output to say we will fund ventures in themselves so that they can take on and train and develop their own staff. Because that's the only viable way for growth. So whilst you can, of course, draw on lots of capable people and volunteering and other ways to give additional skills input in, personally for me, growth is only when it happens internally. But going back to David's point about what is the engine? I mean, I probably see there's a train that needs to develop here. You really need more people that will take higher level risk and provide the blend of support that these ventures need at differing stages of growth. And at the moment, we're getting an evolution of a certain type of investor that will take a certain type of creditable risk that the commercial sector wouldn't take before. But there's very, very few doing this early stage heavy lifting to build up that internal capacity. There are lots of models out there where you can get technical assistance, but I don't think that's the route to go. It's a short term, it's rather like a guarantee. I mean, guarantee to my mind is a short term solution. It's not fundamentally changing whether or not an institution will invest off their balance sheet into something. So I just struggle with that as a term, even though I recognise that skill support is fundamental.
Yeah, sorry. Right behind you, the mic.
Thanks. My name is Helen Gichohi. I am from the Equity Group Foundation. Just in the way of a brief, is a foundation that's been spawned by a bank, which has a customer base of 8 million, and basically has been trying to work to democratize financial access for the poor. And what we're trying to do is to create a relationship between a business, a commercial entity, and a foundation to really try and bring a different way of working in order to create social change. And I think to the point of Chris, and I guess all the points you're making, is that whilst there's skepticism about the need for technical assistance, I think it's a real need. And partly what we found through data from this bank that has a huge customer base is that even with your typical enterprises, and where you've had growth, some amount of growth in small and medium-sized enterprises, is that the crunch point is reached because of lack of that capacity. And even where there is willingness and where these people are not looking for financial injections from elsewhere, they have the finances internally, that the hurdle becomes the lack of knowledge of the kind of management systems and the kind of capacity that they require. And so it becomes imperative, if you want them to go beyond that hump, to actually provide and find ways to provide this technical assistance. So it doesn't just affect social enterprises, it is affecting your other enterprises. And what's been clear from the data as well is that where you've got a huge diversity of SMEs that have grown across various sectors, is that where they would be creating huge job opportunities and creating reducing youth unemployment, again, because of the management capabilities that they have, they're unable to do that. And so what the bank is trying to do is really look out, and with the foundation, is to look at ways that it can use that commercial entity and the foundation entity to bring, to find grant financing, as well as other types of money to really deal with this, which we consider to be a huge problem. The second thing that we found interesting is to Chris's point, is that when you support people in early stages of enterprise development, is that you find this ecosystem of challenges, whether it's supplier and inputs for a farmer, whether it is the distribution channels, for whatever it is. And again, we're finding that unless you do find partners who can unlock and deal with these different challenges, that is very difficult. And even for an institution that sits in a privileged position like ourselves, that especially on the policy side, it's really difficult to deal with that and get the systemic changes that you need dealt with in order to really scale the kind of innovations and the kind of work that you want. But I think to Pramil, and this is a question, is whether you've tried groups as ways of improving your repayment of loans, because we found through the bank and the foundation that when we deal with groups and we deliver financial literacy, because financial illiteracy is one of the challenges of loan repayment, we found that by dealing with groups, there's a pressure that's exerted by other members of the group, and it really does help with the repayment rates for your loans, because the others do want to be able to have access to that capital. The others do want to make sure that they don't hurt their own reputation and their own ability to access that finance. And so that group pressure works exceptionally well, especially amongst women. So you may want to try that as one of your models within Kiva.
Yeah. I can't wait to compare notes with you afterwards, because Equity Bank's been such a leader in Kenya, and you're so much further down the path of learnings of what works and what doesn't. As we try to do this direct person-to-person model in Kenya, we've done an experiment now with groups, just saying, well, if it worked for Eunice, why wouldn't it work here, right? So, and as you state, significantly higher repayment rates amongst the group loans. So, I think as we can kind of learn from the mechanics that you guys have kind of developed and said, this is what wins, this is what works, hopefully we can reach people who have been overlooked at lower cost.
Just one final point in terms of the question of distribution channels. Again, and I run the foundation, so I'm kind of enjoying the access to a huge infrastructure of the bank. I think what we're finding is that the ability to scale and finding ways of using whatever institutions exist. In this case, I have the advantage of having that bank. We're able to roll out programs. We have a program where we're doing financial literacy just by creating ways of leveraging on this infrastructure, 150 branches, 10,000 agents. We've been able to train about a million people in financial literacy within a space of 2 years. So whatever infrastructure you find exists within a country, find ways of creating the partnerships that will help you leverage on those relationships and create distribution channels that may be unconventional. Who would have thought about a bank working to do with doctors and medication and stuff like that? But we are using that infrastructure, and it really helps us to get to where we need to, especially that last mile where people are really disadvantaged. Thanks.
I want to ask Willie. Willie, I think congratulations. I think you've passed your, I never quote numbers, 500? $500 million of financing. Congratulations. But your other is that you might stand up, I can't see really, is that this issue, there you go, wow, now we can really see Willie. But the question really about, that I think is so interesting, the technical assistance term, we get it. It's a term that has too many associations with the past and a different context. But if we use the venture capital analogy, people investing, and looking for really significant dynamic change and growth, realize that there's management skills and other funding, other resource comes in that human context as well as in pure capital or debt capital, however you see it. Your own growth and work has, I think in many ways, borne that out, that without providing a certain level of that other level of support to your partners in the field, it's very hard to achieve greater scale. I mean, it doesn't just happen because you have the funding. Can you speak to that?
In our case, we're providing credit and I wouldn't call it technical assistance, financial advisory services. And the financial advisory service, I'd say most importantly, allow us to reach the earliest stage businesses and do a little bit what Chris was talking about, where but for 3-5 days of support on putting together their cash flow and tightening up their their financial statements, etc., they wouldn't enter into our portfolio, much less ever graduate to a bank or another social lender who maybe is targeting our AAA clients. The challenge is that when you're in agriculture, and especially at the smallholder level as a lender, it's the high risk, low return sweet spot, right? And there's not enough margin for us to pay for the technical assistance ourselves. I know that's not the right term, much less the farmers who are super cash flow lumpy and not very profitable, especially if it's primary agriculture production, to pay for it. So where to go from there? And what we've done somewhat successfully is we've gotten other folks in the ecosystem of supply chain actors, for instance, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, which is a major donor to us for the financial advisory services, and they see it, it's coming out of their philanthropic window, but they see it as a supply chain security investment. And so that's an interesting other twist on it, is that somebody else is saying, I'm going to write down that cost because in effect, it's hitting my bottom line if my unbankable suppliers don't get access to capital to invest in quality or invest in volume and so on. But there's no question that when we started Root Capital about 10 years ago, we thought it was a question of capital constraint. It's that, and as much as that, it's qualified employees and it's access and knowledge of markets, and you got to figure out a way to cover the waterfront. You can't just come with the capital. Or if you do just come with the capital, you're kind of constrained to the AAA, gold standard organizations, which frankly, even in the fair trade space now, are pretty well banked. But how do you get to the folks who are way out there at the end of the dirt road deep in the countryside? We haven't cracked the nut yet, but we're working on it.
There's another, I don't know if John Price is here. In terms, even at Calvert, I think you have a long history of being a conduit of capital to social businesses and enterprises and community development. Our own experience with you has been great. I mean, we tried to do a Communities at Work fund of say up to $200 million of capital to be deployed for small business lending by CDFIs, community development finance institutions in the U.S. And the 100 million or so we got out, and then it gets harder and harder. And what was very interesting was very often we thought, and everybody was about the availability of large amounts of capital. It's increased in our perception too, and I'd like your thoughts on is some of what Willie is saying is very important. The capacity of those intermediaries may not be there unless we deploy with it other tools.
Yeah, with it other tools, that's true. So what we launched about 3 years ago in 2010 is a fund directed to U.S. intermediaries called CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. And our goal at the time was to deploy $200 million. This was a time when the economy in the U.S. had contracted and job growth was paramount. And so this was a conduit to job growth. As Bob indicated, we got out $100 million about. A majority of that was in large lumps, the AAA standard that Willie was talking about, 20, 30 million, to these very high quality credits. And then we got, a little stuck getting out the rest of the capital. And it has made us reflect about what kind of the stopping point was. And to be honest, in that market, community development financial institutions, it was needing more net assets, grants on their own balance sheets to lever more of the senior debt capital. So I think back to what Chris was saying, there's a lot of certain type of capitals, risk-averse senior debt, perhaps in the marketplace, and not enough of the early stage, more risk-taking capital for others to leverage. And so there is a glut in our space of a lot of people wanting to come in, I would argue, to have safe returns and also mitigate loss. And what we really needed in that case was more equity, more grants to pad or to leverage the balance sheets of those particular institutions. So I think as this industry has grown so rapidly, there's a lumpiness appearing, a lumpiness in types of capital running here, a lumpiness in technical assistance, a lumpiness in capital building. And we need a little bit of a smoothing effect or some kind of cohesion to bring it together in a more rational and organized way so that it moves into organizations in kind of the right percentages or rations to help that scaling happen. And from the vantage point where Calvert Foundation is sitting from, very frankly, where we deal with senior debt that we're trying to deploy across the globe, there is a lot of it right now. And we're looking for more of that catalytic capital, and this I think is us as an industry, to help these, to unlock the other types of capital which seem to be in excess. And that has been what we're seeing at this moment in time. Again, very dynamic, could change tomorrow.
I wanted to ask the panel, and I guess everybody around here, what has struck me, and I guess Edwin's aware of this, sort of thoughts I've had recently about 10 years of this space in the forum and this sort of synchronicity of that. There's been a lot of celebrating of the influencer. But it seems to me that we need to celebrate a bit more of the enablers. Mm-hmm. And that is not sexy and not pretty, but it's where the difference is made. And what's neat, in being on the foundation side at Citi, we're investing more of understanding what works and what doesn't. And so I'd ask the panelists, and including Bob, and those in the audience, what are your thoughts a bit about that, and how can we do better at letting everybody know? It's pretty cool to be an enabler, and it's really neat to see that there are more enablers in here than influencers, but we don't celebrate us. We don't celebrate data as much as we probably should.
Well, you gathered from my opening comment, I absolutely support that. And I think, I'm not sure that, I think that's as much as a problem, the fact that many of the businesses or enterprises in this sector are relatively small and therefore inevitably are dominated by the influencers, because that's how businesses start. If you look out in the those businesses that are genuinely scaled, the people who filter to the top are often the enablers, who are the very effective enablers, and we'll get more leaders of larger scaled enterprises when we have more bigger ones. I think the other thing we can do, and it was a point I was linked to the question up there about how we build this capacity. We have focused very much, and we always do, and of course I'm guilty of it as much as anybody because we finance, on bringing, whether you call it TA or management capability, with finance. The vast majority of small businesses, and I suspect the same is going to be applied to social enterprises, grow without finance. We should not assume that the whole space is going to be driven by only those businesses that raise money from Kiva. We would hope there's going to be lots of great ones that grow, that actually work out a self-sustaining model, and they grow without investment. And they need this management capability and resources. So one of the things we could think more laterally, in terms of encouraging enablers, is how do we get in the enablers into the businesses, not just the ones we're financing, but the ones that are growing that don't need finance. Because that, if you looked at the analysis with the SME space, it's only the majority of businesses that raise big chunks of outside capital. It's only a minority. So we think we need to think more broadly, because I think if we get more of those capable enablers into the enterprises, actually that will drive, dare I use the word, businesses that look more attractive for the AAA rated investor or the equity investor, or that's what the enterprises need. They don't necessarily need the capital other than to fund those enablers.
I'm just, I was just reminded of, the quote by President Clinton, all progress depends on a larger sense of us and a smaller sense of them. And I wonder if the dichotomy of influencer and enabler, what I really see, for example, when Citi starts doing kind of a new product in the market that was once perceived to be too risky and now is experimenting with it, that is influencing other banks in the market to take notice, right? So, who's an enabler, who's an influencer? I think it's just really all of us, and oftentimes I know Kiva is inspired by, for example, what Root's done in the rural ag space. They're the influencer for a system like Kiva to start looking more upmarket beyond microfinance into SME lending. And so I think your point, Graham, is a really good one, and I'm seeing this trend at the Skoll World Forum, which is instead of a celebration of the social entrepreneur, it's really a social entrepreneurs don't look at kind of system palliatives. They actually look at how they can make systemic change, and we need to celebrate the system. And who was it today at the morning plenary who said, there's a difference between entrepreneurship and leadership, and we need to be looking at leadership now.
Yeah, look, I don't think we are at a point where I want to celebrate anything, really. I think what what I do think needs to happen, though, and it touches on what Jan was saying, that I represent a sector probably with the highest risk capital out there. And I think a lot of my peers deploy that capital in very risk-averse ways. And yet, so you have the foundation sector that I think is still predominantly risk-averse, short-termism, and therefore you're not leveraging off, I think, a pool of capital that can help take risk. And the fear of failure is the poison of innovation, and I think there's a lot of fear of failure. I mean, if you're doing this stuff, you fail. Yeah, that's life, that's business. Yeah. So I think there's a pool of capital that is risk averse, but should be deployed in a risk averse way. But we need to syndicate across the sectors to create that landscape of change. And at the moment, I think we're still all operating a little bit in silos. So if we're operating as an accelerator, or what we want to call it, a catalytic philanthropy, we need to start syndicating with people at the next level who are there to have that baton in theory passed over them. But I'm pretty certain that we'll still have to play a role, whether it's us or someone else like us. But at the moment, I see a real dearth of high risk early stage capital coupled, and it's not just a capital issue, it's how do you build in the essential skills that are likely to lead to a viable business with a viable management team. And the essential elements of it are business planning, financial management, marketing. I mean, it's not rocket science what they are. Can we capture that and then get some sort of allegiance and a cross-sectoral reform rather than all run around with huge transaction costs on our own part, trying to pick up little bits at different parts. And as from the market sense, from the entrepreneur sense, that is a massive cost. The cost of trying to go out and find people to help you on this journey is tremendous. It's tremendous. And that's in part a function of us not working in a collective way. And we can all specialise in doing different bits, but we do have to start collaborating a little bit more. So I preface that by saying, look, I think we're all doing a good job. We'd all say that, wouldn't we? But I mean, we could do so much better. We could do so much better.
Wow, well, I'm looking at all these hands.
My name is Maggie Dupree, and I work in the energy sector for about 15 years. And the question for Primo, but the other panelists, Chris and Chico, might have used. I think this crowdsourcing or crowdfunding model is so incredibly amazing in terms of disruption. And I've been thinking about how can we apply that to macro projects? So people's energy, right? Everybody wants to solve climate change. If you we all want to play a part. And I think, Jacqueline talked about this morning, getting capital to work for us and communities to work for us. I'm just wondering if you are specifically looking at macro projects like wind farm projects and the renewable energy projects. Are you going to dabble in that, please? And what do you think about the opportunity?
So we want to let the work teach us. So we started with, are you familiar with Barefoot Power? They're a solar power distributor. So we started with our first $50,000 loan on the Kiva website to Barefoot Power in Tanzania at the distributor level. And that got funded in 8 days by over 1,000 people. And then the next one for $22,000 got funded in 2 days. So what I'm wondering about is, a 7-figure project. We're looking at a solar field in the Galapagos, so that the island can actually just be energy independent. And that's a much larger project, but I'm confident the internet community will want to take a small piece of it. And then when I get to your point of syndication, it'd be really interesting if institutional capital could layer on top of it and match the internet community. So we're not working kind of independently, be a bunch of trees falling in the forest, no one really kind of being aware of each other, but it would be great if we could expand the platform to make it easier for institutional capital to match the retail capital as well. So stay tuned for more, and we'll see. I think there's a strong appetite for that. And one company that I think is very interesting to look at is Solar Mosaic, just launched in the US, and that's refinancing rooftop solar panels and in kind of a P2P form.
My name is Jess Wiener, and I sit at a really interesting intersection, thanks, in that I run a social messaging strategy firm that works with brands and businesses to help articulate messages about products and pro-social campaigns using experts and advocates and activists and influencers. And so I'm sitting here listening to this conversation thinking about how do we message out everybody's amazing intentions and passions to get better quality and more applicants for this. And so my question is for you, Primal, I'm like in love with Kiva Zip, and I'm wondering about the case studies that you mentioned in the Bay Area of the woman with the vacuum cleaner. Are undocumented workers able to get financing through Kiva Zip, and what are the potential repercussions for profiling of that online, and how does that, because that is a community that I'm working with in Los Angeles, and I'm highly interested in cultivating that social entrepreneurship in that community, but there's an incredible risk factor for them coming forward and starting that business.
Yeah, why don't we talk afterwards?
Okay.
It's going to be very specific.
Right.
That's a good one.
Anybody else in a broad, Mitchell, yeah, and then I'm sorry yourself too.
I would love to just see a showing of hands of those who think that if we crowdsourced first loss layers of impact financing facilities, that people like the ones you and me in this room, would you put $10 or $50 in the first loss layer of a larger facility that others would come into, that would be managed by somebody who's good at making loans, these small loans that are very, very hard for larger institutions to do? Because unless we do them sort of in aggregate in a portfolio approach, our colleagues who aren't quite as see the light like we might be think it's too risky. But if you put it into a portfolio approach, and I personally believe that there's I don't know how many billion people there are in the world today, but if you got $1 from kind of a nice percentage of them, that'd be a lot of dollars that could go a long way to each of these impact sectors. And I think I said this to somebody yesterday about an ag facility that was going to be 70% trade finance. Trade finance is nice, but that's not what we need. We need that 30% of expansion capital through the growth stages that's going to be there, open-ended fund, so that good managers can deploy this capital when it's needed. And we all share together. Because, I have $50, I have $10,000 to put into this field. I personally don't have $200,000 to put in a fund of funds. So who would be willing to put $10 to $50 in a first loss layer for a global impact lending fund?
There you go.
Thank you.
The gentleman on the end.
My name is Sushant Zanganapur. I manage the Skoll Center. And I wanted to come back to the question around not the dichotomy, but the continuum between the influencers and the enablers. Personally, I think that the next era we have is the era of the enablers. We're deeply desperate for real models, the breakthrough models of how the recipes make sense. How do you actually make these things come to life? Making social change happen for real. So in this new era, I'm interested in your reflections on what happens to the influencers. We have this very important asset, which is our brand, which is the light we shine on the various issues and the power to convene the best and brightest minds and actors around the world. So what should we be convening them around? And what hard, sticky issues need to be decoupled that we could use our influence towards openly?
One of the things I remember at my first Skoll World Forum was people were complaining about USAID, the social entrepreneurs. And now, I don't know if Mara's still here. Okay. Well, now now USAID has a chief innovation officer, but the chief innovation officer and another director from USAID is here at the forum, right? So it's really, I think, I beg to differ around celebration. I actually think what we need to do is call out, those are our leaders right there. They're people who represent big systems, but they're just human beings. We have someone from OPIC here. Kiva and OPIC should probably start talking to each other because, we've never really had a conversation, I think, that's substantive. And so I think what it is I'm really glad that it's beyond social enterprises, and I think it is the era of the enablers and really celebrating them. And we need to highlight a few test, kind of a few success stories of where it's really scaled up, and that's what I would. I think people are looking for bright spots, because otherwise it's so impossible to seem like things will change. So we have to highlight those bright spots.
Chris, I'll take liberty as being here. I think it's very interesting, this what you're saying, and I've long, not come to many of the forums that were social entrepreneurs. I mean, I felt as though there was enough angels in a room to be blessed. They didn't need me, and or I was on the wrong side of the table or something. But I think unless you really are influencing more than each other, but which is important because there's an experience there that you share and you have to build, and access to similar type resources, and to know that you're part of a community. But unless you can bring influence on other stakeholders, whether they be in the cabinet office or in a U.S. agency or in Citibank or in somewhere else, or into that matter into the heart of Shell and other places too, which is I think what Chris tries to do in many ways through his work, will be an influencer, or ourselves in whatever, as Premal said, whatever we do, we are ourselves using these experiences to influence our product development people. Customer service and outreach and all the analysis we do around needs of communities. It's very much influenced by what we do here. So my sense is that this gap between the belief that social entrepreneurship sits here and then there are large systems out here, very few of the type of change you're looking to make can occur without at least engaging some of those large systems. Right? It's sort of like, I know we've got fabulous things on cell phones, or let me use electricity. I always say to my colleagues, we're really not going to build a lot of little mini power stations, and we may use solar really properly in places that can't be. But ultimately, we want to get people on the national grid. Your real goal's got to be to get them on the biggest, lowest cost, supported system that you can, but influence that system to serve those people. And unless you can engage with both, it can be a very narrow discussion. So certainly from those of us from the dark side that have come on to the light and want to be influenced and convey that message, I think it's very important that the whole dialogue continue to evolve and be more inclusive in a way.
Sorry, I can't do celebration. I'm a Brit. I have a cynical gene. We're not all like Eeyore in this country, but we're not Tiggers like North Americans. So, but if I go back to influence, I don't think any of us can influence anyone without evidence. Yeah, that's the core of this, and I think it's therefore beholden on all of us to prove that we can generate this blended value return. And I think at the moment there's a huge amount of hype. There's a lot of evidence on the social return. I'm not seeing much in proven financial return from this. So I think it's beholden on all of us to say that these businesses can wash their face financially, because then I think you've got the ability to influence people to say, do put your money, as I would subscribe to Mitchell's view, into something. I mean, at the moment, if you look at interest rates, savings rates in the UK, getting my money back would actually be quite attractive from putting $50 in. So it's not a high bar, I think, to leverage that capital. But we only leverage that capital if you're getting really good market opportunities to invest it in. And I think this is where we need to, there is a number of us that can develop opportunities to then use that capital in ways that will generate a net positive return. Because you can lose money quite easily by just investing it randomly. So my big anxiety, and I never thought I'd be saying this, going to have to interact with government. As a business person, you just kind of run shy of that. But unfortunately, and the reality is, we're going to have to work with government because there's so many policy barriers and issues. But I think, again, from an influence side, the only way I think I or anyone else in this room from the private sector can influence government is on the basis of evidence. That you can use this capital in a far more efficient and effective way than the state. Therefore, the state has got to change its policy environment to facilitate that. So it's beholden on us still to collate the evidence and the success stories that Pramil was talking about. Okay, and then maybe I'll grant you a little bit of celebration in 10 years' time.
My name is Batil Misika. I work for the OECD. We've created a network of foundations working for development that Chris is a proud member of, so proud that he forgot to mention us. I had to say it, Chris.
I knew that was coming.
Until you actually mentioned government, I was thinking, is somebody going to mention it? Not because I represent the OECD, really. I couldn't care less. I'm not here as the union of governments. It's just, it's interesting. If we were to reverse the situation, this were a conversation we would have at the OECD. We would say, oh, and by the way, there is some funding to leverage in the private sector. And, be talking about what government. And so we would look at what we call drivers of change, whatever theory of change, power analysis. What you guys have been, we're talking about the same things. DFID created the drivers of change approach years ago. And it was looking at how you look at the individual, the organization, the enabling environment, including the retarders of change. And you've been discussing the exact same thing, except that there's a part of the equation that I feel is missing in that conversation, and that's the part to be continued, which is you need to take it to a different theater stage with some of these governments that I agree with are not the most fun people to talk to or the easiest to engage with, because you have all this regulatory reform that can be retarders of change. You have governance. If you have bad governance, no matter how well you train people, if you have corruption, it's useless. It's like putting money down the drain. So I raised my hand earlier about that fund, but actually if you're telling me that we're going to put it in Haiti, where I've worked, I'm putting my hand down. Unless I can see that we're doing other things with the government, because it's not just about the money. So I just wanted to point out those are the things that we've been trying to also reflect upon and put these issues in front of relevant ministers, looking at these, telling them that there's a lot of private capital to be leveraged out there, including new ways to do philanthropy, like venture philanthropy, that it's important to develop these partnerships, and that you need to look at the government to help you leverage. So maybe also they can be part of the risk taking with you. They don't like risk very much, and they've just cut their aid budgets, but we'll figure it out. So I encourage you to come to us if you'd like to have this conversation continued in one form or another. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the last to celebrate, Antony, you just mentioned, I saw on Twitter, I think it was, or someone brought it to me, you have a new prize, a DNA Profit with a Purpose prize, 100,000 quid. And is that for only UK? Why don't you tell us what it's for?
No, it's for UK, it's for entrepreneurs looking to launch enterprises that are going to deliver an impact. I think it's now on our website. It is 100,000. I think it's due, I'm trying to remember the timing, May? I can't remember exactly the timing of the applications, but meant to be done by the summer. We've actually got a few little leaflets which Andrew will leave out. 13th of May, a month.
Okay.
To get your applications in.
Well, thanks, and thank you for that. Well, there you go. And if you're in the UK, I'd say thank you to everyone. I particularly want to thank Edwin, who is always quietly here but makes all run, and Graham, my colleague, Graham Wright too, they've worked so much together in helping us to try to articulate a little bit of this discussion today, which carried on very well. I hope it's a big conversation, but in our new format. And to myself, in saying thank you, I just find that as we look at influences and enablers, I've always never known where I sat or my colleagues. I think we sit in both camps sometimes, but without being with folks who can help us to challenge and question. When you use that example of the FSA, well, to me, this is the financial services agency. It's just another nightmare of another heavy regulator of the banks. I would never have thought, though, that it would have constrained all sorts of others from entering into basically student finance. And it may have been a good cause or not, but without working across sort of those silos that we all live in professionally, and I think Skoll is increasingly doing and pulling us together in forums like this. I think we find new influencers and enablers, and within ourselves an ability to play a role in both camps sometimes. So again, for me to say thank you to all of you, and enjoy the next sessions, which is really the break. We have a break now, don't we, until the theater? Okay, thank you all.